And we've done models, we've done controllers, and now it is on to views, specifically template views and HAML, which, again, if you've been reading the book, you know what this is. If not, read the book. OK. So here we are. We are down to the last component in the model view controller stack. Again, views are primarily the province of the application server. Views generally don't need to talk to the persistence database, because remember that models, which are stored there, their interaction with views is by passing information to the controllers. So what do we have to say about views? Not a whole lot. Views are pretty simple. You sort of already saw an example when we talked about HTML very early on. The views that we're going to use in the Rails version of Model View Controller follows a pattern called template view. So again, architecture is about alternatives. I'm going to tell you the way that Rails does it, and then we'll see, well, what other ways could you do it? So in a template view pattern, it just means that the view is basically a bunch of markup like HTML, but there's certain places in the markup where stuff can be inserted at runtime. Like the value of some variables could be substituted into the HTML, or maybe a little tiny bit of code could be run, and the result of running that tiny bit of code would be substituted. Again, in the elder days, so not that long ago, for like when I was a grad student or something, it used to be that this was the application, right? PHP largely evolved this way. You start by kind of writing a view, and there's places where instead of just HTML, you put $PHP, and then you put some stuff. Maybe it's just the value of a variable. Maybe it's a few lines of code that goes through a loop and prints out a table of things. So what does this look like in our simple diagrammatic notation? Here's this word, closure. Everybody was awake last time when we were talking about blocks and closures, the fact that blocks carry their environment around with them. So how does the template view renderer work in Rails? Well, you got a HAML template, which is basically a concise version of how you specify HTML. And we're going to combine that with a closure. Remember, what is a closure? It's the environment visible at some point in the program. And in the case of Rails, it's essentially the environment visible at the moment your controller method finishes. Right? So the user did something, your controller method got called because the right route was found. The controller method does a bunch of stuff. It sets up a bunch of variables. That entire snapshot of state is a closure, and that's what becomes made available to the renderer. Which is really nice, by the way. What's not obvious about this picture is that the closure doesn't have to come from the controller. It can come from anywhere. And as we'll see, this is actually a really elegant way to get reuse, because you can actually pull pieces of views in from other stuff. But what's the output of this step? The HAML gets translated to HTML. The code and the variables in the closure are evaluated, and they're substituted into it. And what pops out is an HTML page ready to send back to the happily patient user. And by the way, you don't have to write your views in HAML. One other choice, which we'll explore when we do more advanced topics, is RJS. So you could actually have a template of stuff that will expand into JavaScript that will execute on the client once it arrives there. And the JavaScript can interact with your app to do things like those cool animation effects, and new content appears, and you hover over it, and donuts show up. Or the system that actually comes with Rails by default is called ERB, for Embedded Ruby. ERB looks a lot more like the way PHP does things. And honestly, the reason that we don't use it in this course, even though HAML is not the default way that Ruby does things, it is much more concise. And as a community, Ruby community in particular values conciseness, because in most cases it leads to greater clarity. So since I always say once I show you how to do something, you should be thinking about, well, what else could you do if it wasn't this? Well, another possibility is you could use what's called the transform view as opposed to template view. In the transform view pattern, there's some kind of models that have some data in them. There's a closure. And these go into a renderer that outputs something else. So what's missing from the right-hand side compared to the left-hand side? On the left-hand side, we had a HAML template with some markup and some things that get filled in. Nothing like that over here. Right? So this basically says, I'm going to take some objects like movies, and I'm going to generate a representation of them that isn't embedded in sort of an HTML template. It's just some other representation of the objects themselves. So one example might be an XML representation of the objects. Another example might be JSON, which is a JavaScript notation that is sort of spiritually similar to XML and lets you represent complex data structures. Why would you want to do the thing on the right instead of the thing on the left? When is template view appealing versus when is when is the transform view more appealing than using template view? Well, obviously, if you're doing a web app and human beings are the consumers, they need to see something, right? So it makes sense to say, OK, HTML is what browsers display. we're going to put out some HTML with application-specific data substituted into it. But suppose your exact same app is being called as a service from somewhere else. So instead of a user clicking on look up this movie, there's another service, like the movie reviews or IMDb service, making a call to you and saying, look up this movie. That service probably does not want to receive an HTML page that it then has to dissect and scrape, like I showed in that really ugly example that was non-RESTful a few slides ago. What it really wants is a nice structured representation of just the thing it asked for, such as in XML or in JSON format. And in fact, the action view rendering system that comes with Rails can do all of these things. And we'll see a neat method for saying, without modifying anything else in the controller method, you could say either return an HTML template for human consumption, or take the exact same result you would have given anyway and return XML or JSON for machine consumption. So HAML is described in the book and in many, many great websites. But just to give you a very quick overview, it's like HTML on a diet. So unlike HTML, instead of open and close tags, indentation is used to figure out where tags get closed. You could have tags entirely on a single line, like this H1. Or you can have a tag that's got stuff nested inside of it, like this table tag. The pound notation is used to specify HTML IDs, and the dot is used to specify classes. In other words, it's deliberately made to look like CSS. Why? Because people know CSS. You can have lines beginning with a dash, which is Ruby code that gets executed, but the output is silently thrown away. Or you could have a line beginning with equals, which is Ruby code that's executed, and the output is substituted into the template at this point. Right? So again, if you've done something like PHP, this is very similar. And here's an example of Ruby code that uses those helpers that I talked about when we did RESTful routes to create a link that's automatically going to have the right URI for a request to create a new movie. Can you have multiple lines of code, like a line that goes beyond one screen? Yes, that's what these red bars are for. If the red bars look clumsy and ugly, that's deliberate. Why? Because code shouldn't be in your views. All the interesting stuff should be in the model, maybe a little stuff in the controller to kind of set up some variables that are going to be substituted in the view. But pretty much everything in the view should either be straight HTML or really, really, really simple substitutions of variables that were set up in the controller. So don't put code in your views. Okay, syntactically, nothing's going to stop you from doing it, but HAML makes it awkward to do it because MVC advocates having thin views and controllers. All the stuff that really matters should be in the model. What about, if you need to make an object look nice, instead of having the built-in format for a date, you want to display it in some friendly format? Not a problem. Rails gives you a place to put helper methods whose sole job is to prettify things so that they'll look nice when the user sees them. But don't put code in your views. If you want to read about ERB, this is what comes with the built-in render that comes with Rails. It actually looks a lot more like PHP, so it may seem like it's more comfortable, but believe me, once you try HAML, you won't go back. It's so much more streamlined, and once you get used to not having clutter, you come to really appreciate it.